After the massacre of millions, Earth had one response: no more mercy. Part 1: The Day the Sky Burned. The first thing I heard when I opened my eyes was silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind you get on a quiet morning when the city is still asleep and the birds have not started yet. This was a different silence. Heavy. Final. The kind that tells you something enormous has ended and nothing will ever sound the same again. I was lying under a section of collapsed ceiling. Dust was everywhere. My left arm was pinned under a slab of concrete that had to weigh more than a car. I could not feel my fingers. My face was pressed against the cold floor, and I could taste blood where my lip had split. I did not know how long I had been unconscious. Minutes. Hours. I had no way of knowing. I moved my free hand slowly and pressed it flat against the floor. I pushed. The concrete shifted just enough for me to drag my arm free. The pain that followed was sharp and immediate, shooting from my wrist all the way to my shoulder. I pressed my teeth together and breathed through it. I had trained for injury. I had trained for pain. I had spent 6 years in the Planetary Defense Corps learning how to function when everything around me was falling apart. None of that training prepared me for what I saw when I finally crawled out from under the rubble and stood in what used to be the main operations building of Karachi Colony Command. There was nothing left. Not nothing in the sense that the building was damaged. Nothing in the sense that I could see the sky directly above me, wide open and pale gray, because the roof was gone. The walls on 3 sides had come down. The floor was a broken mess of twisted metal, shattered glass, and concrete slabs piled on top of each other at wrong angles. Fires burned in several places, slow and orange, feeding on whatever material they could find. The air smelled like something chemical mixed with something I did not want to identify. I stood there for a moment. Just stood. Because my brain needed a second to process the fact that a building I had walked into 30 minutes ago was now a ruin. I pulled out my communicator. The screen was cracked but still functioning. I had 17 missed alerts. All of them were from Earth Defense Network. The first one had come in at 13 minutes past noon. The timestamp on my communicator now read 41 minutes past noon. 28 minutes. I had been unconscious for 28 minutes. I opened the first alert and read it. Then I read it again. Then I sat down on a piece of broken wall because my legs were not working properly anymore. 17 cities. Across 6 continents. Gone. Not damaged. Not evacuated. Gone. I scrolled through the alerts with my thumb moving slowly, almost carefully, as if going faster would make the words change. Mumbai. Lagos. Vancouver. Sao Paulo. Cairo. Seoul. And 10 more. Each one had been hit by what the Defense Network was calling a directed energy discharge from orbit. The alerts described the pattern as coordinated and simultaneous. 11 minutes from the first impact to the last. 11 minutes. Someone had planned this. Someone had calculated the exact timing required to hit 17 separate locations on a rotating planet at the same moment. That level of precision did not happen by accident. It did not happen in a hurry. This had been worked out carefully, over a long period of time, by someone who wanted the result to be total and immediate. I stood back up. I made my legs work. I spent the next 4 hours digging through rubble alongside whoever I could find. There were 14 of us in the beginning. Soldiers, administrative staff, a maintenance worker named Owen who had been fixing a water pipe in the basement when the strike hit and survived because basements absorb impact differently than open floors. We pulled people out. Some were breathing. Some were not. We did not stop for either. By the time emergency units arrived from the outer districts, we had recovered 31 people from the immediate area. I do not know how many of them made it through the night. I was not there to find out because a medic took one look at my arm and put me in a transport vehicle before I could argue. I woke up in a field hospital that had been set up in a public stadium 15 kilometers from the impact zone. The air inside smelled like antiseptic and recycled oxygen from portable systems running at capacity. Every cot was occupied. Every corridor had people sitting or lying on temporary mats. Medical staff moved between them quickly and quietly, doing what they could with what they had. A nurse named Diane came to check on my arm about an hour after I came around. She was somewhere in her 40s, with short hair and efficient hands, and she did not waste words. She told me the arm was fractured in 2 places but had not broken through the skin. She said the swelling would get worse before it got better. She told me I was lucky. I asked her for the total count. She did not look away. She did not hesitate. She simply told me the current confirmed figure was 412 million. She added that the number was still rising. I did not say anything. I do not think she expected me to. She finished her assessment of my arm, marked something on her tablet, and moved to the next cot without another word. I watched her go. She did not cry. Her face was composed. Her hands were steady. She had probably delivered that number to a dozen people already, and she would deliver it to a dozen more before the day was done. The Vreth had been part of our world for 9 years. First contact had happened quietly, through signal exchange and slow diplomatic channels. They had presented themselves as a measured species. Bureaucratic. Procedural. They communicated through formal delegations and lengthy documents full of language about mutual recognition and shared galactic space. The Galactic Council, the governing body that connected dozens of species across this region of the galaxy, had formally introduced humanity to Vreth representation in the 3rd year of contact. Everything had been slow and careful and official. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday, they fired on 17 cities without a single word of warning. The Galactic Council response arrived at the field hospital on a shared broadcast channel 6 hours after the strikes. I watched it on a small screen mounted near the ceiling of the medical ward, along with about 40 other people who were well enough to hold their heads up. A council representative delivered a formal statement. He expressed deep concern over the events of the day. He acknowledged the significant loss of life. He described the situation as deeply troubling and called on all parties to exercise restraint and pursue diplomatic channels for resolution. He did not say the Vreth were wrong. He said the Vreth had described the strikes as a territorial demonstration. He said the council was reviewing the matter. A territorial demonstration. 412 million people, and they called it a demonstration. Someone near me in the ward said something under his breath. I did not catch the exact words, but I understood the feeling behind them. The same feeling was sitting in my own chest. Not hot. Not explosive. Something colder than that. Something that settles in and does not move. A soldier 2 cots over from me was watching the broadcast with his jaw set and his eyes very still. His name was Colin. I had met him briefly in the triage area earlier. He had lost 2 fingers on his right hand and had not complained about it once. He looked at the screen for a moment after the broadcast ended, and then he looked at me. He said, "They're waiting for us to ask for help." I said, "Then they're going to wait a long time." The Earth War Command broadcast came through at midnight. It was not long. It did not use dramatic language or emotional appeals. It was read by the Director of Unified Command in a flat, clear voice, and it said exactly what it needed to say. All existing diplomatic agreements with the Vreth were suspended immediately. All council-mediated communications were being placed on hold pending internal review. Earth was moving to a full wartime operational structure effective at 00 hours. Every branch of planetary defense was being placed under unified command. Resource allocation, manufacturing, research, and civilian infrastructure would be reorganized to support a single sustained objective. The message ended with one sentence. Humanity will determine its own response, on its own timeline, and in its own way. No signature. No further statement. Just that. The ward was quiet after the broadcast. Not the broken, numb quiet of people in shock. Something different. Focused. Like 40 people all arriving at the same conclusion at the same moment without saying it out loud. I lay back on my cot and looked at the ceiling. My arm ached all the way up to my shoulder. My mouth still tasted like dust. Diane came back around to check on a patient nearby. As she passed my cot, I asked her if she was going to be all right. She stopped. She looked at me for exactly 2 seconds. "No," she said. "But I'll be useful." She walked on. I stared at the ceiling for a long time after that. The lights in the ward hummed faintly overhead. Outside, somewhere, the city was still burning in places, and the emergency crews were still working through the night. I thought about the word demonstration. I turned it over in my mind slowly. I thought about what kind of species looks at 400 million lives and calls it a message. Then I stopped thinking about it, because thinking was not what was needed anymore. I closed my eyes and let my body rest. Tomorrow, I was going to find out where they needed me. Part 2, What We Became in the Dark. I reported for duty 9 days after the strikes. My arm was in a brace that ran from my wrist to just below my elbow. The medical staff had cleared me for light assignment, which in their language meant a desk and a screen and no fieldwork until the fractures healed. In my language it meant I had 2 functional arms and a working brain, and I was not going to sit in a recovery ward when there was a war being built from the ground up. The officer at the intake desk at Forward Planning looked at my brace, looked at my file, and assigned me to Project Iron Blood without any expression on his face at all. I had heard the name before. Most people in planetary defense had heard it mentioned at least once, usually in the context of budget reviews where it got cut, or in briefings where it was described as theoretical. It had existed for years as a small, severely underfunded research and development division that worked on what were officially called advanced contingency systems. In practice it was a group of engineers, physicists, and strategists who spent their time asking a question nobody in official channels wanted to answer openly. The question was, what would humanity actually need if the galaxy ever stopped being friendly? For years the answer had been, we do not need to worry about that right now. Now it was the only question that mattered. Project Iron Blood had been moved into a converted industrial facility on the outskirts of what was left of the Northern District. The building was enormous and ugly, all exposed steel and concrete with high ceilings and temporary lighting strung between support beams. It smelled like machine oil and working people. When I walked in for the first time, the floor was already busy. Dozens of teams moved between workstations, and the sound of machinery and focused conversation filled the space from wall to wall. Nobody looked up when I entered. Everyone was already in the middle of something. The officer who met me at the door was named Dr. Yeva Sorokina. She was a physicist and systems engineer who had been the project's lead researcher for 3 years before the strikes and its director for the 9 days since. She was in her late 30s, with dark circles under her eyes and the focused energy of someone running entirely on purpose. She shook my hand with a firm grip, glanced at my brace without comment, and started walking. She talked while she walked, which I quickly learned was her standard mode of operation. She said, "We've been given full resource access as of 72 hours ago." Full means full. No budget ceiling, no approval chains above my authorization level, no committees. If I say we need it, it arrives. You're going to help me manage the coordination between our combat systems division and the tactical planning group. You've got a field background, which is what I need on that bridge. The theorists and the soldiers have to speak the same language, and right now they do not. I said I could do that. She said, "Good. Do not tell me you need time to settle in." There is no time. I said I was ready now. She almost smiled. It looked like it took effort. She took me through the facility section by section. The first area was propulsion research, where a team of 12 was working on drive systems for the new generation of warships that Earth was already contracting to build. She stopped at one workstation and pointed to a set of readings on a large display screen. She said, "The Vreth use a standard efficiency drive that runs at about 62% of theoretical thermal maximum. They keep it there because going higher causes material stress on components. Our team has been running at 81% in sustained tests. The components fail eventually, but they fail in an acceptable window for combat operations. We accept the maintenance cost. They cannot outrun what they cannot catch." I looked at the numbers. I said, "Who decided to push past the standard threshold?" She pointed to a man at the far end of the workstation who appeared to be in his 60s, with white hair and grease on his hands even though he was working at a screen. She said, "His name is Gerald. He lost his daughter in the Vancouver strike. He has not slept more than 4 hours a night since. He does not require motivation." She said it without drama. As a fact. We moved to the next area. This was materials testing. A section of floor had been cleared and a section of reinforced hull plating from one of the new ship designs was mounted vertically in a testing frame. A team was running impact assessments on it. The lead researcher was a woman named Catherine who could not have been older than 26. She explained the process quickly and clearly, and she used her hands when she talked, pointing to specific sections of the plating and describing the stress distribution in the material. I asked her how they had improved the plating compared to previous designs. She said, "We stopped optimizing for minimum weight. Every previous generation of design tried to balance protection against mass efficiency. We removed that constraint. We built for maximum protection and then figured out how to make the engines compensate. The ships are heavier. They're also harder to damage." I asked who had made that call. She said, "I did. After the Lagos report came out. The projections showed that lighter hull designs would result in significantly higher crew losses in a direct engagement." She paused. "I have a brother. He's 17. He'll be old enough to serve in about a year." She said it quietly and then went back to her display without any other explanation needed. Yeva and I kept walking. The Combat AI division was in a separate room at the back of the facility, cooler than the rest of the building because the servers needed the lower temperature. The team there was feeding the system an enormous amount of data. Not modern tactical data alone. Historical data. Every recorded conflict in human history, going back thousands of years. Every strategic record, every field report, every account of how humans had fought and adapted and found unexpected solutions across centuries. The system was learning patterns. Not just modern warfare patterns. The deep patterns of how humans think when they are pushed to their limits. I stood next to Yeva and watched the data feeds for a moment. I said, "Are you teaching it to think like us?" She said, "I'm teaching it to predict us. Because if it can predict us, it can predict outcomes. And if it can predict outcomes, our commanders can make better decisions faster than any enemy who has never fought a human before." About 3 weeks into my assignment, a Vreth scout vessel was intercepted near the outer edge of the solar system by one of our long-range patrol units. It had not fired on anyone. It appeared to be gathering sensor data. Our patrol unit disabled its propulsion with a targeted systems disruption and brought it in. The crew was 4 individuals. They were given a clean, secure holding facility. They received food and water. Their injuries from the boarding process were treated. Medical staff checked on them twice daily. None of them were questioned under duress. None of them were mistreated in any way. This was a decision made at the highest level of Earth War Command, and when I first heard about it I asked Yeva why. She said, "Because we're not them." She let that sit for a moment and then added, "And because what we do with them matters more than what they did." After 2 weeks, the Vreth crew was placed on a transport vessel and released. Before they were allowed to leave, a single message was burned into the outer hull of their ship using a precision cutting tool. It was written in every known language of every known galactic species. 14 languages total. The message said, "This is the last mercy you will ever receive from us." They left without responding. I stood on the observation level and watched their ship move away on the long-range display until it disappeared into distance. Colin was standing next to me. He had been reassigned to Ironblood 2 weeks earlier. His missing fingers had been fitted with a functional prosthetic that he kept saying felt strange but worked fine. He watched the ship disappear and said, "Do you think they understood it?" I said, "They understood it." He said, "Good." The days in that facility built up into weeks and the weeks built into months. People came in before dawn and left after dark and came back the next day. Nobody talked about how tired they were. Exhaustion was present, but it was treated like weather, something that existed in the background that you worked around. I watched Gerald the propulsion engineer eat his lunch at his workstation every day without looking up from his calculations. I watched Catherine run back-to-back materials tests for 16 hours and then start reviewing the data before she went home. I watched the AI team feed their system through the night while the servers hummed steadily in the cold room. I watched all of it and I understood what Yeva had been trying to show me from the first day. This was not an army being built out of anger. Anger burns hot and burns out. This was something that had taken everything people felt and turned it into structure. Into process. Into precision. Every bolt, every calculation, every line of code was an act of construction. Controlled. Deliberate. Permanent. The Vreth had expected mourning. They had expected diplomacy. They had expected humanity to send delegations to the Galactic Council and file formal complaints and wait for a process to unfold over the course of years. Instead, they got silence. And the silence was full. One evening, near the end of my 4th month at Ironblood, Yeva called me into her office. It was a small room with no decoration at all except a single photograph pinned to the wall above her desk. A family picture. 2 adults and 3 children, standing in front of a house somewhere with green grass and sunshine. I did not ask about it. She said, "The fleet construction is ahead of schedule. The first combat-ready vessels will be finalized in 8 months. Command has set a departure window." I said, "We're going to them." She said, "We're going to them." I sat with that for a moment. The idea of humanity leaving its own solar system not as explorers, not as diplomats, but as a fleet of warships heading outward with a specific destination in mind. I said, "Are we ready?" She looked at me for a moment with those tired, focused eyes. She said, "We were ready the day we stopped crying and started building." I thought about Diane in the field hospital. I thought about what she had said about not being all right but being useful. I looked at Yeva and said, "Then let's finish it." She turned back to her screen. I walked back out onto the floor where Gerald was still at his workstation and Catherine was reviewing a new set of materials reports and the servers in the back room hummed their steady, patient hum. We had 8 months. We were going to use all of them. Part 3, The Stars Don't Care, But We Do. The fleet launched on a morning in early spring, which was strange in a way I still cannot fully explain. Spring is a soft word. It belongs to green things and longer days and the feeling that something good is about to begin. It does not belong to a column of 4,200 warships breaking atmosphere in coordinated sequence, leaving trails of fire across a pale blue sky. But that is the morning it happened, and I remember standing on the upper deck of the ISS Reckoning and watching the surface of Earth fall away beneath us with the kind of feeling that has no clean name. Not excitement. Not fear. Something between those things, underneath them, older than both. The Reckoning was a heavy command vessel. One of the first 12 completed under the Ironblood construction program. It was not beautiful in the traditional sense. It was functional and large, with thick hull plating and drive systems that ran hotter than anything the Vreth had ever put into space. The crew complement was 460. Every one of them had volunteered for the expeditionary assignment knowing exactly where we were going and what the objective was. I had been given the rank of captain 4 months earlier. I still was not fully comfortable with the title, but I had stopped saying so because Yeva told me that comfort was irrelevant and what mattered was whether I could do the job. I could do the job. Our commanding admiral was a woman named Grace Ellison. She was 61 years old and had spent 35 of those years in planetary defense. She had the kind of face that gave nothing away and the kind of voice that people instinctively stopped talking to hear. She had lost no one in the strikes, which I privately thought made her more reliable for this command, not less. Grief has weight. She carried none of it. She carried only clarity. As we cleared the outer edge of the solar system, transmissions began arriving from across the galactic neighborhood. Some were from Vreth monitoring stations, almost certainly logging our departure and sending the data back to their central command. Some were from neutral species who maintained long-range observation networks and kept track of any large fleet movement as standard procedure. And some were from others. The Thelai, a small and generally quiet species who operated 2 inhabited systems near the edge of Vreth territory, sent a message that arrived on the Reckoning's bridge about 6 hours into our journey. It was short and plainly worded. It said that the Thelai government wished to formally express its sorrow for what had happened to Earth and its regret for its own failure to speak during the council sessions that had followed the strikes. It said, "We are sorry we said nothing. We hope you understand that saying nothing was also a failure." I read it twice. Then I saved it to a personal file. I did not know why exactly. It just seemed like the kind of thing that should be kept. Most of the other transmissions we received were less personal. Several came from Vreth-affiliated species, formal communications demanding that the fleet halt its advance and submit to council mediation. We acknowledged receipt. We did not respond further. The Galactic Council itself sent 3 separate messages over the first 2 weeks of our journey. The first requested that we state our intentions. The second demanded that we clarify our legal standing under council treaty frameworks. The third warned that a failure to comply with Council directives could result in our continued suspension from Council participation. Admiral Ellison drafted our formal response to all three. It was transmitted on open frequency so every species with a receiver could hear it. She said, "You had 412 million chances to prevent this. You used none of them. Do not speak to us of restraint." That was the entirety of the response. No further comment. I was on the bridge when the message went out. I watched the communications officer send it. Nobody on the bridge said anything for a moment after it went. Then someone behind me quietly exhaled and the sound of the ship resumed around us. Our first engagement came at the 43rd day of travel. Vreth Forward Intelligence had established a base of operations in a region near the outer boundary of what they formerly called their territorial corridor. It was a significant installation, built into the frame of a large asteroid body. Sensor data showed defensive platforms on three sides, a fleet of 32 vessels docked or holding position nearby, and deep structural tunnels carved into the rock that housed their operational command. I had reviewed the tactical plans 4 times before we arrived. The fleet's combat AI system had modeled 600 separate engagement scenarios using the historical pattern data it had been trained on. Admiral Ellison had reviewed the top 12 outcomes and selected the approach with the highest probability of complete objective success and lowest overall risk to crew. We came out of our transit jump at a calculated distance and held position for exactly 8 minutes. During those 8 minutes, we transmitted a single message to the base on standard Vreth communication frequency. The message stated clearly that the installation was a military target, that we were offering a single opportunity for non-combat personnel to evacuate in any direction they chose, and that we would hold our position for 8 minutes before beginning our approach. The 8 minutes passed. No evacuation vessels launched. We moved in. I will not pretend that what followed was precise and clean in the way that training scenarios always look clean. Real engagements are loud and fast and full of decisions made in seconds with incomplete information. But I will say that our crews performed the way they had been built to perform. Steady. Focused. Every order followed, every position held, every maneuver executed with the kind of discipline that comes not from automation but from training so deep it has become instinct. Their defensive platforms engaged us first. We had anticipated their firing patterns from sensor data and positioned our shielding vessels to absorb the initial contacts. Our return fire targeted the platform power sources rather than the platforms themselves. Removing the power source takes the weapon offline. It is more precise than direct destruction and it demonstrates control. The Vreth fleet moved to engage. They had 32 vessels to our advanced strike group's 41. Numbers alone do not decide outcomes. Our ships were faster. Our targeting systems processed engagement data faster. And our crews had something the Vreth commanders had not accounted for. They had never fought humans before. Not really. They had attacked a populated planet from orbit. That is not the same thing. That is not the same species. Their tactical patterns were structured around an opponent that would adapt in predictable ways, because most galactic species fight according to established galactic tactical doctrine. There is a large body of shared understanding across the galaxy about how fleet engagements work, what moves follow what signals, what responses are standard. We had studied all of it. And then we had ignored a significant portion of it. A fleet that does not follow expected patterns is very difficult to fight, because every decision your commander makes is based on predicting what the other side will do next. When the other side does something outside the recognized range of expected responses, your commander has to pause and reassess. In a high-speed engagement, that pause has consequences. Their fleet commander paused 4 times in the first 2 hours. I tracked it on the tactical display. Each time our ships did something outside his modeled expectations, the Vreth formation shifted as they reassessed. Each reassessment cost them time. Each cost in time cost them position. 6 hours after we began, the base was secured. Their remaining vessels had either withdrawn or gone quiet. The defensive platforms were offline. The command tunnels inside the asteroid had been entered by our boarding teams and cleared without incident. We held the installation. There was no celebration on the Bridge of the Reckoning. I looked around and saw the same focused, tired faces that had been there at the start of the engagement. Someone at a rear station was updating the fleet status log. The communications officer was sending the post-engagement report back toward Earth on a long-range relay. The ship hummed around us. Colin appeared at my shoulder. He had been assigned to the Reckoning as tactical liaison and had spent the engagement at the secondary display station coordinating between ship groups. He said quietly, "They expected us to stop." I said, "I know." He said, "They fired everything they had at our front line, and when we kept moving they didn't know what to do with that." I said, "That's the point." He nodded slowly. He looked at the tactical display for a moment where the cleared installation showed as a solid green marker. He said, "What happens now?" I said, "Now we keep going." Admiral Ellison came on ship-wide communication that evening. She addressed the entire fleet across all vessels. Her voice was the same it always was. Clear. Even. Without any performance in it. She said, "Today the fleet completed its first operational objective. Every crew performed their function with precision and discipline. We incurred no losses that were not anticipated within acceptable parameters, and we achieved full objective success. This is what we came here to do. Tomorrow we continue." That is all. No dramatic language. No declarations of triumph. Just, "This is what we came here to do, and we did it, and tomorrow we continue." I stayed on the bridge for a long time after that, watching the stars on the forward display. Out here they looked different than they did from Earth. The familiar groupings were shifted, arranged in unfamiliar patterns because our position had changed. I had spent time as a young officer learning to navigate by the stars in training exercises, and I found myself trying to locate reference points I recognized. I found a few. Most of them were gone from their expected positions. Behind me the crew moved quietly through their duties. The ship's systems ran their steady cycles. Somewhere in the lower decks, engineers were reviewing drive performance data from the engagement. In the medical bay, a small team was running post-action assessments on anyone who had taken any contact. We had 43 days of travel behind us and an unknown number ahead. I thought about the Theli message still sitting in my personal file. "I hope you understand that saying nothing was also a failure." I understood it. I had understood it for a long time. Silence, when something wrong is happening, is not neutral. Silence is a choice that lets wrong things continue. We were not silent. The stars moved slowly in the forward display as the Reckoning continued on its heading. I pulled up the fleet status map on the side panel. 4,200 vessels, spread across a massive coordinated formation, all moving in the same direction. Toward the Vreth home system. Toward the end of this. I took one more look at the stars. Then I turned away from the display and went to review the tactical plans for the next phase. There was work to do. Part 4, No More Mercy. I have been in enough difficult situations in my life to know what it feels like when a moment becomes permanent. Not important. Not significant. Permanent. The kind of moment that you know, even while you are still inside it, is going to live with you for the rest of your life. You will carry it in your chest like a stone that becomes part of you over time. Not heavy anymore, just present. Always present. Walking into the Vreth High Command facility on the 4th day of ground operations was one of those moments for me. Getting there had not been simple. The Vreth home system had defenses that their forward installations did not. Their planetary orbital grid was substantial, layered in a way that reflected real engineering care. Their home fleet was larger and better coordinated than anything we had encountered in the outer territories. And unlike the crews at the forward base who had perhaps not fully believed we would come, the crews here knew exactly who we were and what we intended. They fought hard. I want to say that plainly and honestly because it matters. They were defending their home. Whatever else the Vreth had done, whatever decisions had led to the massacre of 412 million people, these were soldiers doing what soldiers do when an enemy reaches the place they care about most. I respected that, in the specific way that you can respect something and still be committed to defeating it completely. The orbital engagement lasted 4 days. Admiral Ellison commanded from the Reckoning throughout. She slept in intervals of 3 hours, ate at her station, and made decisions with the same even clarity she had shown from the beginning. Our losses during the orbital phase were real. I will not pretend otherwise. Some of the names I knew. Some I did not. All of them had volunteered for this mission knowing what it required. Once the orbital defenses were cleared, ground operations began. The fleet's landing contingent descended in coordinated groups, and I was attached to the 3rd Command Unit assigned to the capital region. We moved through a landscape I did not have a prior image in my mind to compare it to. The Vreth homeworld had its own character, its own colors and atmosphere and geological features that were neither ugly nor beautiful in terms I had any frame of reference for. Just different. Entirely different from anything I had seen. The ground campaign took 9 days total. I want to be clear about what that means and what it does not mean, because the clarity matters. We were there to eliminate military capability. Every objective assigned to every ground unit was a military installation of one kind or another. Command facilities. Weapons depots. Communications arrays. Defense research centers. The planning that Iron Blood had done over the previous year had created specific, mapped, verified target lists. Units had assigned objectives. The assignments did not include civilian infrastructure. They did not include population centers. Every officer commanding a ground unit had those boundaries built into their operational framework, and those boundaries held. This was not charity. It was not weakness. It was a deliberate choice made by people who had spent a long time thinking about what we wanted to be at the end of this. We had not come to become what had come to us. There was a conversation I had with Colin on the 5th day of ground operations, during a quiet period between objective sequences when our unit was holding position in a secured industrial sector. He was sitting on a section of equipment casing and looking out at the sky, which was a color somewhere between green and gray that I still find difficult to describe. He said, "Do you think this is what they expected?" I said, "No." He said, "What do you think they expected?" I thought about it for a moment. I said, "I think they expected us to either collapse or to become something that the rest of the galaxy could point at and say we deserved what happened to us. Either break down or go too far. Those were the 2 options they thought we had." Colin looked at the sky. He said, "And instead we just came here and did the job." I said, "Exactly that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's going to bother them for a long time. That we just came here and did the job." It was on the 8th day that the request for a meeting came through. The Vreth High Command sent the request through formal diplomatic channels, which required routing it through a neutral relay station. Admiral Ellison reviewed it and approved an in-person meeting at the secured facility we had established in the capital region. She appointed a delegation team and she put me in it. I spent the evening before the meeting reading back through my notes from the past 18 months. The field hospital. The Iron Blood facility. Gerald at his workstation. Catherine and her hull plating. The AI servers in the cold room. The 8-minute hold before the first engagement. The Thelai message. All of it. I did not do it for any analytical purpose. I just wanted to remember everything clearly before I walked into that room. The meeting was held in a large, plain space inside our secured facility. Temporary tables had been arranged, and the lighting was the standard portable kind we used across all our ground installations. There was nothing designed to impress. Nothing staged. It was a functional room for a functional conversation. The Vreth delegation consisted of 3 individuals. One was a senior military officer, a position equivalent to a Joint Chiefs Commander in our own structure. The second was a government administrator with a civilian title I did not fully understand but which indicated senior executive authority. The third introduced himself as a diplomatic representative, and it was clear immediately that he was the primary speaker. His name translated roughly as Advisor Sararin. He was calm. He was polished. He spoke our language through a translation system with careful precision, choosing words deliberately and making eye contact with each member of our delegation in sequence as he spoke. He began by acknowledging the situation. He used words like significant and regrettable. He spoke about the importance of reaching an understanding that allowed both species to move forward. He talked about the value of stability in the region and the shared interest that all galactic species had in preventing further conflict. He was very good at what he was doing. If I had heard this speech in a different context, about a different event, I would have considered it a genuinely skilled piece of diplomatic communication. When he finished, he looked at me. I was leading the delegation. I looked back at him for a moment before speaking. Then I said, I want to tell you about a city called Karachi. He waited. I said, Karachi was a colony city. It had about 4 million residents when your forces struck it. It was not a military installation. It was not a strategic target in any traditional sense. It was a city where people lived and worked and raised children and went about ordinary lives. It had schools and hospitals and public transport and restaurants and every other thing that a living community contains. I paused. I said, I was there when the strike hit. I was in an operations building on the edge of the administrative district. I was buried under rubble for 28 minutes. When I got out, the building was gone. When I reached the field hospital, the nurse who assessed my arm told me the confirmed death count was 412 million. She said it the same way you say anything factual. Because there were no words available for something that large. Advisor Saren did not look away. He held my gaze with the practiced steadiness of someone trained to manage difficult conversations. I said, I am not telling you this because I want you to feel something. I am telling you this because I want you to understand what you are responding to right now. You are not responding to a military confrontation between two powers with competing territorial interests. You are responding to what happens after an act that took 412 million lives in 11 minutes. That is the context of this conversation. Not geopolitics. Not treaty frameworks. Not the Council's procedural language. This. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, we are not here for revenge. I want to be precise about that. Revenge is an emotional response to personal loss. What we are doing is something different. We are establishing a permanent condition. We are writing a rule into the way this region of the galaxy operates. The rule is this: what was done to Earth will not happen to Earth again, and any species that considers doing it will look at what happened here and understand the outcome. Advisor Saren said, we understand the gravity of what occurred. We are prepared to discuss terms that reflect that gravity and that provide a foundation for stable coexistence going forward. I said, I am going to give you the terms. They are not negotiable. The terms were as follows. Complete and permanent dismantlement of the Vreth military fleet, to be carried out under joint human and neutral third-party observation over a defined timeline. Dismantlement of all orbital weapons platforms and ground-based strategic systems. A reparations program running for 1,000 years, structured as material and resource contributions to the reconstruction of the communities destroyed in the strikes. A formal public acknowledgement of responsibility, to be broadcast on all Vreth government channels and on open galactic frequency simultaneously, delivered by the Vreth High Command in its entirety, live, with no editing or delay. And a permanent monitoring framework maintained by a neutral oversight body with human representation, reviewing compliance at regular intervals for a century. No occupation. No forced governmental restructuring. No population consequences of any kind. Just the complete, permanent removal of the capacity to do what they had done, combined with the public acknowledgement that it had been done and that the cost was being paid. Advisor Saren was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, you understand that complete fleet dismantlement leaves us without the capacity to defend ourselves from other potential threats. I said, yes. He said, you are not concerned with our security. I said, we are not responsible for your security. You had an enormous fleet and you used it to strike civilian populations. The fleet is gone. What you build from here is your decision, within the constraints of the monitoring framework. He said, and if we do not agree to these terms? I looked at him steadily. I said, then we continue what we are doing until there is nothing left to continue against. And then there are no terms at all. This is the choice. These terms, or no terms. Another silence. The military officer spoke for the first time. He said something to the administrator in their own language that the translation system did not catch clearly. The administrator responded. Then the military officer looked at our delegation and said, through the translation system, in a voice with no emotion in it at all, we accept. I did not feel triumph when he said it. I want to be honest about that. I thought I might. I thought that hearing those words after everything that had happened might feel like something releasing, like pressure finally finding an exit. It did not feel like that. It felt like the completion of a task. Necessary. Required. Done. As the meeting ended and the VRETH delegation prepared to leave, Advisor Sarin stopped near me. His colleagues moved ahead. He looked at me with something in his expression that I could not fully read. Something genuine, I think. Something that had gotten past the diplomatic surface. He said, "I want to ask you something, if you are willing to answer." I said he could ask. He said, "What are you people?" I have studied humans. I have read everything available about your species. And I still do not understand what I have seen here. You suffered an enormous loss. You did not collapse. You did not act without control. You built something methodical and permanent and you brought it here without letting it become what was done to you. I do not understand how a species does that. I was quiet for a moment. I thought about everyone I had seen in the past 18 months. Diane in the field hospital, steady-handed and useful. Gerald at his workstation in the early morning. Catherine with her hull plating and her 17-year-old brother. The AI team in the cold room. Colin's missing fingers and his quiet observations. Yeva and her single photograph pinned above a desk in a bare office. I said, "We're what happens when you make humans stop hoping for something better from you." We stopped hoping. We stopped waiting. We built what we needed to build and we came here and we finished it. That's all this was. He looked at me for a moment longer. Then he nodded very slightly, and he walked away. I watched him go. Then I went to file the post-meeting report. Part 5, What We Carry Home. I did not expect the silence on the journey back. Not silence between people. There was plenty of conversation on the reckoning during the weeks of travel back toward Earth. People talked in the mess hall and in the corridors and in the crew quarters late in the evening when the day's operations were done. They talked about ordinary things, mostly. Food. Home. Plans. The kind of conversation that surfaces when the main thing is over and the mind starts moving toward what comes next. The silence, was inside me. I had expected something different in the aftermath. I did not know exactly what. Some sense of resolution, perhaps. Some feeling of completion that matched the scale of what had been accomplished. But instead there was this quiet that had taken up space in my chest and did not feel like resolution. It felt more like the silence after a very loud sound stops. Your ears are still adjusting to the absence. You are still waiting, faintly, for the noise to come back. I spent a lot of time during those weeks sitting in the observation area on the upper deck of the Reckoning, a small room with a wide viewport that looked directly forward. The stars at travel speed have a particular quality to them. They do not blur the way old fictional depictions suggested. They hold their positions mostly, shifting very slightly at the edges of perception, but their light has a kind of steadiness to it that I found useful for thinking. I thought about a great many things. I thought about the 412 million. Not as a number, though the number was always there. I thought about the individual scale of it. 412 million individual lives, each one containing everything a life contains. History and memory and preference and habit and love and small daily ritual. Every one of them gone in 11 minutes. No warning. No choice. No reason given that made any sense in human terms. I thought about what we had done in response and whether it had been right. I came back to the same answer every time I reached the end of that thought. Not because the answer was easy. Because it was the only one I could find that was honest. We had done what we said we would do and we had done it the way we said we would do it. We had not deviated from the boundaries we set for ourselves. We had not become something that required explanation or apology. We had looked at the worst thing that had ever happened to our species and we had built a response that was permanent and controlled and proportionate in the only sense of that word that applied to something this large. Was it mercy? No. We had said that clearly. Was it justice? I thought it was. I thought it was the closest word. I thought about the VRETH delegation. About Advisor Sarin's question. What are you people? I had answered him, and I had meant the answer. But sitting in that observation room with nothing but stars in front of me and weeks of travel behind me, I thought about the question again from a different angle. What are we? We are a species that learned to use fire before we had a word for danger. We are a species that walked out of the places we were born and crossed oceans without knowing what was on the other side. We are a species that has spent most of our existence in conflict with ourselves, with each other, with the natural forces of a world that was often trying to end us, and we are still here. We adapted. We persisted. We suffered enormous losses across our history, and we found ways to continue. And we have always, eventually, found a way to rebuild. That was the thing Advisor Saren could not fully understand. Not the military capability we had constructed. Not the precision of the engagements. The rebuilding. The fact that after the worst thing, we do not simply stop. We start again. The fleet arrived at the boundary of the solar system on a Thursday morning, and the signal that went ahead of us confirmed our return. By the time we crossed into the inner system, Earth was visible on the forward display, a small blue shape in the darkness that grew larger as we approached. I watched it grow from the observation room. I had seen Earth from orbit many times in my career. It had never looked the way it looked to me on that morning. I could not have explained why exactly. Something about the distance we had come and the things we had done and the weight of everything we were carrying back with us. Colin came to the observation room a few hours before we reached orbit. He sat in the chair beside me and we both looked at the viewport for a while without saying anything. Eventually he said, "Do you feel different?" I thought about it honestly before answering. I said, "Yes. I am not sure yet what the difference is." He nodded. He said, "My mother is in Exeter. She kept sending messages through the relay system during the campaign. I have 47 of them queued up that I have not opened yet." He was quiet for a moment. I am not sure why I did not open them. I think I was afraid they would make me feel something that I needed to not feel while we were still in the middle of it. I said, "Are you going to open them now?" He said, "On my way to read them right after this." We sat for a few more minutes. He said, "What happens now? To us? To all of this?" I said, "I do not entirely know. There is a monitoring framework to establish. There is reconstruction on Earth that has years left to go. There are species out there who are going to have to decide how they want to relate to humanity going forward, now that they know what we do when pushed this far." He said, "The Thelai." I said, "Yes. And others." He looked at the growing shape of Earth in the viewport. He said, "I hope we do not become something they are afraid of." I said, "I think some of them should be. The ones who would do what the Vreth did. I think a certain amount of fear in the right places is not the worst outcome." He thought about that. He said, "And the ones who are not a threat. The ones who just watched and did not know what to do." I was quiet for a moment. I said, "The Thelai said they were sorry they said nothing. That matters to me. It matters that they said it. I think there is something to build with species who understand why it matters." He nodded slowly. He stood up, put his hand briefly on my shoulder in a simple gesture that needed no explanation, and walked toward the door. He stopped at the threshold and looked back. He said, "For what it's worth, I think we did this the right way. I think we did it the way the people we were fighting for would have wanted it done." He left before I could respond. I sat there for a while longer. I thought about what he had said. About doing it the right way. About whether 412 million people, if they could have known, if they could have seen what came after, would have recognized themselves in what we did. Not in the conflict. In the discipline. In the refusal to let ourselves become something that required its own apology. I thought about Diane, who had not cried and had kept working. About Gerald, who had put his grief into calculations that made our ships faster. About Catherine, who had thought about her brother and built armor that would protect people like him. About Yeva, who had said we were ready the day we stopped crying and started building. I hoped they were all right. I hoped the ones who had lost someone were finding ways to continue. I knew that hoping was not the same as knowing, and that the work of recovering from something this large does not end when the military objective ends. It goes on long after the ships come home. We reached orbit and the process of coordinating return and landing began in the organized, methodical way that the fleet handled all large operations. I left the observation room and went to the bridge for the final phases, standing at my station and managing the coordination of the Reckoning's role in the landing sequence. From the bridge displays I could see Earth clearly now. The cloud systems moving across the surface. The geography visible in patches between the clouds. The Terminator line separating day from night on its slow crawl. Admiral Ellison was at the command station. She caught my eye once during the landing sequence and gave me a brief nod. Nothing more than that. But I understood what it meant. We had done the thing we came to do, and we had done it as ourselves. I landed in what used to be the Southern Administrative Zone near Karachi. The reconstruction was visible from the air. New frameworks rising through the rubble. Machinery moving through cleared sections. Roads being laid across areas that had been open waste 6 months ago. It was not fast work. It was not going to be finished soon. But it was happening, steadily and persistently, the way humans tend to do things when they have made a decision to continue. I walked through it alone. I told the transport crew to wait and I went on foot into the reconstruction zone without any particular direction in mind. I wanted to feel the ground. The actual ground, under my actual feet. The dust had settled. It had been 18 months and the raw, sharp smell of fresh destruction had given way to something else. Dry and mineral. The smell of earth and concrete and building material. The smell of work in progress. I walked for a long time. The memorial was being built at the northern edge of the zone. I had heard about it during the campaign when updates from Earth came through the relay system. A wall, curved in a long arc, made of a material that would last without maintenance for centuries. The names were being inscribed by hand. Each name individually. 412 million of them. The project had been started immediately after the strikes and would not be finished for years. I went there. The sections that had been completed were extraordinary in a way that is hard to describe to someone who has not stood in front of something like that. The names were small, precise, and perfectly spaced. Thousands of them across the completed sections already. Hundreds of thousands. Each one a person. Each one a life. I walked along the completed sections slowly. I found my parents' names. I found my sister's name. I put my hand flat against the stone. The stone was cool. It had been in shadow. The material was smooth except for the slight texture of the inscribed letters under my fingertips. I stood there for a while. I did not try to do anything particular with what I was feeling. I just stood there and let it be what it was. A message arrived on my communicator. I took my hand off the stone and looked at the screen. It was from the HFY. The same address as the message I had saved from early in the campaign. The one that said they were sorry they said nothing. This one was brief. It said, "We have been following the news of your fleet's return. We are glad your people are coming home. We hope Earth is beginning to heal. We hope you and those close to you are all right." Then it said, "We do not expect an answer. We just wanted to ask." I stared at the message for a long time. Outside, the reconstruction crews were moving through the zone. Machinery hummed in the distance. The sky over Karachi was clear and pale blue, the kind of blue that belongs to a city that is still here and still going. I put my communicator away. I looked at the wall for a while longer. I thought about what Advisor Sarin had asked me, "What are you people?" and about the answer I had given him, and about whether the answer had been complete. Maybe it had not been. We are what happens when you make humans stop hoping for something better from you. I had said that. I meant it. But we are also what happens after that. The part that comes after the stopping. The part that returns and stands at a wall with 412 million names and puts its hand on the stone. The part that receives a message from a small, quiet species saying we just wanted to ask, and feels something in its chest that is not the cold settled permanence of the past 18 months but something older and warmer and more stubborn than all of it. That part, too. I pulled out my communicator again. I opened the HFY message. I wrote back. I said, "Thank you for asking. Ask us again in 100 years. We will let you know." I sent it. Then I put the communicator away and stood at the wall a while longer, my hand against the cool stone, the names of 412 million people around me in every direction, the blue sky above, the sound of a city being rebuilt all around me like a slow, steady heartbeat. We had done what we came to do. And we were still here. That was the thing. After everything. After the 11 minutes in the field hospital and the cold room with the humming servers and the stars in unfamiliar configurations and the meeting in the plane-secured room and the long journey home. We were still here. We would always still be here. That was not a threat. It was not a promise made to anyone outside ourselves. It was simply what we were.